Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we're going to be talking about how to base coat an Imperial Fist using an airbrush. We're going to start by using some Citadel paint, and we're going with a initial pass of Mournfang Brown, and we're going to be using a Hard and Steam Back Evolution airbrush. So when base coating any miniature, whether it's an Imperial Fist like I'm doing here, I'll always want to start by thinning my paints a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to be using a mix of water and some airbrush thinner. Now, there are lots of different brands that you can buy that make airbrush thinners. I use Vallejo because I've used them for a long time and I'm quite comfortable with them. In order to thin my paints, sometimes I'll start by creating a mix of thinner in a little plastic cup, as you can see on the video here. Other times I'll mix directly into the airbrush painting cup. So there you can see my Vallejo airbrush thinner. I'm giving it a good shake just to make sure it's all mixed. Now I put a couple of drops of water into a little plastic dish, and then adding some airbrush thinner into the water mix, giving it a swirl and a stir around. And that's what I'll use to dilute my base coat Citadel paint, which is that Mournfang Brown. Now what I'll do is I'll take a few dollops of the Mournfang Brown and I'll place them into a separate little plastic dish. But first I'll add a little bit more water just to make sure that the paint isn't going in neat. So, using a brush and making sure that the paint is shook really well to give it a good stir, we're going to take a little dollop of Mournfang Brown and place it in that second dish. I think I used 2 or 3 dollops there. Now I prefer spraying my paint through the airbrush a little bit thicker as opposed to thinner, because when you're base coating and you're spraying through an airbrush, the thinner your paint is, the less tip dry you'll get generally, but at the same time the lower the PSI you need to use on your compressor. So I like to use a mix, a good medium between the two, not too thin, not too thick. You can see the sort of consistency I'm going for there on the side of the little plastic pots. I actually found that as I was recording this video that mix was a little bit too thin, and you'll see that as I start to apply it to my miniature. It doesn't really spray on too well, so I make it a little bit thicker by adding another dollop of paint into the airbrush, which you'll see in a minute. I always spray through a little bit of water. If you watch my last video, you'll know that I don't like putting paint directly into the airbrush without first putting some water in there just to lubricate the airbrush. So I'll use my mix, pour it into the airbrush there, and I'll start to spray. I've got that little piece of tissue on the desk as well, just to make sure I can test my paint consistency on the tissue before I spray it on the miniature. So you can see me there, I'm just testing how it's spraying out, and I thought it was fine, but when I actually start to apply it, if you notice on the leg, it's kind of spidering and swirling around. It's not really spraying on properly, and that's because the mixture is too thin. And that's okay. I didn't want to edit that part out because I want you to see that you can make mistakes, and that's absolutely fine as long as you correct it and you know how to correct it. So in this case, my initial base coat mixture was far too thin and I was spraying it too high of a PSI. So it was just spraying onto the miniature's leg there, and it wasn't really adhering. It was just pooling everywhere, not what you want. So what I did was I adjusted the PSI of my airbrush compressor just to lower the PSI, and it was a bit better, but I still needed to make some adjustments. You can see that it's still not spraying on as you probably want it to. So I make a couple more adjustments, and I have two options here. I can either continue to reduce the PSI on the compressor, which I didn't really want to do. It was already quite low. I think I was sat around 18 PSI. So what I did instead was I chose to thicken the paint by adding a few more dollops of Mournfang Brown, that is a tongue twister, that one, into my airbrush cup directly. And now you can see that as I spray it on, it's spraying on far, far better. It's got a smooth application and the paint is actually adhering to the miniature now without spidering around and just being a loose mess. So when you're base coating, whether you do that with a brush or an airbrush, you're looking for a smooth application. With an airbrush, like I'm doing here, that means that you want to go through and pass over your model in a couple of coats. You want it to be nice and smooth and the coverage to be even. You always need a solid base coat to work off in order to get good depth on your miniature and smooth finishes. If your base coat is patchy, then everything else that you do after that is also going to be patchy. It's going to be very hard to course correct. So you always want to make sure you've got a good foundation to paint on. Now, the way I'm painting, and I've chosen to paint this Imperial Fist, is by going for a zenithal effect on the model. So there are going to be some good contrasting parts which are definitely deeper and darker in shadow, and others are much brighter. So I started with my black primer, which if you watch my previous video with how to prime using an airbrush, it's the same miniature, and I showcase how you prime initially. The black primer was used because I knew I would then cover it with the brown and it would allow me to have some very dark recesses. So it doesn't really matter if the brown base coat that I'm applying now doesn't go into all of those tiny recesses, because it actually adds to the effect. It makes it seem like the shadows are deeper where they need to be. The reason I'm using a brown here for the first layer, the first base coat layer, so to speak, is because when I apply the yellow on top of the brown, it will create some natural shading and it gives the yellow a warmer, richer shadow. If I was to spray the yellow directly over the black, because of the way that yellow interacts with black as a color, the shadows would become more greeny as opposed to yellowy brown, and I want them to be yellowy brown. You can see here that as you spray through the airbrush, you might end up running out of a paint mix. I decided instead of mixing some more paint up in that little plastic well, I'll just do it straight into the airbrush to save some time. And again, given the PSI I was spraying at, I went for that same sort of slightly thicker consistency. And all I'm doing here is I'm going back over the parts that I haven't sprayed yet, and I'm making sure that I've got that nice solid base coat color to work off. Slowly building up the passes, going around the miniature and just hitting the areas that need to be hit with the airbrush to build up that nice solid coat. And I want a nice solid brown foundation here. Again, you can see that it's not hitting all of those shadows and some parts are still black. That's okay, because that will add to the depth later on. Now, I feel that I've gone over all the parts that I need to have brown at this point. As mentioned in my previous video, it's really important to clean out your airbrush properly. And so that's exactly what I'm doing here. First of all, I'll spray through a load of water to make sure that I get rid of that brown paint that's left in the airbrush. Giving it a good mix around with my brush. And I'm using the brush with a bit of water on it to gently remove any paint buildup on the needle. When you're spraying with an airbrush, one of the most common things that you'll hear is that people have an issue with what's called tip dry. And tip dry essentially is when your paint, because you're atomizing the paint with a mix of air that comes out of the end of your airbrush, it naturally, as air blows over the paint that's coming out of the end, it will naturally dry over the needle, the tip of the needle, as you're spraying air over it. And so that means that not all of the paint that comes out is going to be wet. Some of it will dry and it will build up that dry paint on the end of your needle tip. Now, if you allow it to build up and build up, your airbrush isn't going to spray properly. It's going to end up clogging, being a bit patchy when it sprays. So you want to make sure that you're using the proper cleaning solution and you're using a brush between color changes to make sure that your needle tip is kept nice and clean. And that way you'll avoid tip dry, essentially, because you're always cleaning the needle. Well, I take that back actually. You can't avoid tip dry, but you're removing the tip dry as it occurs to keep your needle clean, and that way your airbrush sprays properly. So you can see that after I ran the water through the airbrush, I'm now using airbrush cleaner. Again, this is by Vallejo, and I'm using that brush again to make sure that the airbrush cleaner is used on the tip of the airbrush to make sure the tip's dry and clean, and I'm spraying it through the airbrush to make sure I get rid of all of that brown color. Now this is really important because our next color that we're going to use is going to be white, and I'm going to be using white to apply a zenithal coat from above. This is going to allow me to accentuate the shadows and the highlights when I spray the yellow color of the Imperial Fist onto the miniature. So it's kind of like pre-shading. So we're still, I would consider this as the base coat of the miniature. We're still painting the base coat, but we're doing it as a zenithal base coat, and the order that I'm choosing to do this in kind of lets you do a pre-shaded base coat. So you're starting with that black primer, you're building up the shadows with the brown, and then on top of the brown you're applying that white zenithal spray from above to showcase where your highlights are going to be on the miniature, so that after your white layer you're going to have your yellow paint applied on top of it, and because we're going to be using a translucent paint, it will still show all of those layers that were previously sprayed, such as the brown and the white. So you automatically get highlights and shadows, and that's really, really useful. Saves you time. It means that you don't have to go in with the airbrush or a brush to start spraying in shadows in different areas. And then if you're not very proficient with an airbrush, I'm probably not the best airbrusher in the world. 100% I'm not the best airbrusher in the world, so I don't need to be trying to apply my shadows and my lights in tiny little areas. You'll see I do a little bit of it later, but it's a very general spraying technique. And that's the whole purpose of these videos. It's showing you that even if you're a beginner and you're new to airbrushing, you can get some really great results without having to worry about spending hours and hours and hours and hours practicing. I mean, the more you practice, the better you're going to be, but it's not that hard. Right, so I applied a couple of drops of thinner directly into the airbrush, and I've added some white paint in there. I'll give it a good mix and a stir around, making sure that everything is properly mixed and ready to be sprayed. And that's what I'm going to use to spray my zenithal layer to really accentuate where my highlights are going to be on the miniature. Again, I'm using that paper towel to just test the consistency of the white to make sure I'm happy with what that looks like. You can see that I've placed the miniature and I'm keeping it level on the tabletop, just to make sure that I get that sort of 45-degree zenithal prime from above. I'm calling it prime, base coat is what I should be saying, over the top of that brown to give me those highlight spots. And I'm doing it as a general spray. Some people will do this in a very, very targeted approach, but I'm not going for that sort of look. I'm going for a general overall zenithal lighting effect for that base coat initially. You'll see I go back in a minute to reapply some white areas just on the the edges of the armor that I think will catch the light a little bit more. But generally speaking, it's a very broad pass that catches most of the armor that I want to be yellow. And again, like the brown, we just rotate the model and keep going over those parts that we want to be brighter, leaving some of that brown in the shadow for us to be able to see. And you can see it when I tilt the miniature there, that the underside of the miniature is still pretty much all brown. And that's because those are the areas that would be in shadow if, you know, he was a real Marine running along the ground. He's not going to be lit evenly from all over the place, as you see on some box art. There's going to be darker recesses, parts in shadow, etc. And if we're aiming for our light source to be located immediately above him, then it's going to cause some direct shadow beneath him. So once again, I'm just cleaning my airbrush out. Again, get used to this if you're going to be spending a lot of time airbrushing miniatures. You need to understand that the process isn't the fastest if you want to do things right. So many people say that, oh, airbrushing is super fast, it's super easy. It is relatively easy, and it is much faster generally than doing things by hand with a brush. But you have to take the time between color changes to make sure you don't contaminate one color to the next. So you do have to make sure that you are actually planning your color changes. You are cleaning your airbrush properly between colors so that you don't cross-contaminate. Now the airbrush is clean, see, it didn't take that long to clean it, but now that it's clean, we're going to be using some Imperial Fist contrast paint. And we're not going to be diluting this at all because it's a contrast paint. It's very much like an ink. It's very watery and runny in its consistency as it is. So there's no need to dilute it with any airbrush thinner. Now, just a second ago, you saw me try to highlight the end of the airbrush there, and that's because I was trying to show you tip dry. The white paint just built up on the end of the needle, so I'm just using some airbrush cleaner to remove that from my needle tip so that the yellow contrast gets sprayed through properly. Something that's actually quite important to note is that if you're going to be using airbrush cleaner to remove tip dry, just make sure you rinse it well and spray it off the tip of your airbrush before you start spraying other paint, because otherwise you're going to do some damage because your cleaner and your paint aren't going to mix, and you don't want that. So I'll take a couple of blobs of yellow Imperial Fist contrast paint and drop that directly into my airbrush. And because we've now set our highlights and shadows by utilizing the black primer, that brown base and the white sprayed on top, when we spray the yellow onto our Imperial Fist now, you'll see that it retains those shadows and it retains those highlights naturally, because your contrast paint that we're spraying through the airbrush is translucent, and so it doesn't completely cover up all of those shadows and highlights that we've created using in the other layers. So you get this nice deep yellow color. And once again, all we're doing here is we're passing repeatedly over the miniature, rotating it, and just making the areas that we want to be more intense by doing multiple passes over them. If you're not happy with something, go back, apply more paint. You can always apply more paint, you can't apply less paint. So take your time and think about which areas you want to be more opaque and which areas you want to be less opaque. Now, as I was spraying the yellow, I really like the depth and the look of it. However, I thought that some of those highlights could be a bit brighter. And I wanted them to just have that little bit extra pop. So what I'll do next, once I've gone through this initial application of the yellow contrast, is I'll go back to the parts that I want to be even brighter and have that brighter value. And I'll use not a white, but I'll use a lighter yellow to kind of reinforce those brighter parts before spraying more of the contrast paint on top of it. There are a couple of choices that I could have used in terms of the lighter, whiter yellow to reinforce the highlight spots. And I've got a couple of different paints. The two that I chose to decide between, I think, was Dawn Yellow. We'll see it in a minute on the screen. Yeah, Dawn Yellow and Ice Yellow. So once again, make sure you clean your airbrush out, spray out that previous colour, add a bit of cleaner, rinse out your airbrush, add some water, spray it out, and then you're good for the next application of colour. Now, I'm purposely leaving all of this stuff in the video because when I've watched videos in the past, people don't always leave in the color changing. They don't leave in the cleaning of the airbrush, so it can sometimes give an inaccurate picture of the process of airbrushing a miniature. And I want these videos to be instructional and informative so that someone new getting into airbrushing actually understands the steps that are involved in airbrushing a miniature, and it's realistic. So you do have to change colors, you do have to clean your airbrush in between colors, and it does take a bit of time. That's okay. Once you get used to it, you just get used to it and it becomes part of the process. You can see that I use a bit of tissue there just to make sure I'm really getting any colour that was in the cup out of it. So there's the miniature after the black primer, the first brown base coat, the pass of white over the brown base coat, and then the yellow contrast sprayed on top of the two. And you know what? If you were happy with that at this point, you could leave it. And that, for a tabletop miniature, once you've painted in all the details by brush or added a wash or two, that would look pretty damn cool. Imagine 20 of those walking across the tabletop in formation. I think that looks good. Now, as I said before, I wanted the highlights to be a little bit brighter. I wanted those main focal points to be a bit more intense and to catch the eye. And so, as mentioned, I was choosing between Dawn Yellow and Ice Yellow. If you look at the two next to each other, Dawn Yellow's a little bit brighter, and I thought that'd be too stark of a jump in contrast. That's why I didn't just use white again. So I decided to go for the Ice Yellow by Vallejo. And I'm just going to apply the Ice Yellow to the tops of the shoulders, the tops of the helmet, and the bottom of the greaves, just to add a little bit more pop to those highlights. So because it's a Vallejo colour, I'll use the Vallejo thinner in the airbrush again and add a few drops into the cup. and we'll get ready to spray that onto the miniature. Now while you're watching me spray that onto the miniature, you'll probably think, oh shit, he's done too much. He's oversprayed on different parts. It's okay, because we're going to revisit it with the yellow contrast again. So even if it seems like it's too much, it's going to get knocked back by that yellow contrast. And it'll end up being quite nice. So here we're going to be a little bit more refined with where we're spraying. Unlike that initial pass of white, this is just going to be sprayed onto the very, very top of the miniature and a few other select places, just to bring that vibrance up a bit. And you can see I'm just placing it where I think the light's going to hit that armor. So anywhere I think should be a bit lighter, a bit brighter, I'll apply the ice yellow. And then don't forget, in a minute we're going to go back over it with more Imperial Fist contrast paint. So what would that make it? It makes it a four-step process, right? You've got the brown, then the white zenithal, and then you've got the contrast, and then the ice yellow, and then another pass of contrast. Okay, sorry, my mistake. That's five stages. So 5 stages to building up what I would consider to be a solid, really nice 3D, good shadows, good highlights base coat for your miniature. It's not that many steps, and as you get into the routine of it, if you were batch painting and you were spraying, let's say 5 to 10 miniatures at a time, it's not going to take you too long. So you might think, oh god, 5 steps to just apply a base coat, that's a bit much. But it's really not, because if you think about it, you're kind of setting yourself up for success for any later stages. You're already placing all those shadows, you're placing the highlights, you're getting good depth and contrast of color, of shadows and lights, so that when you go back over and you define each area even more by using, let's say, an oil wash or acrylic washes, your main work for the body of the color of the Space Marine is already done. And you're not going to have to worry about whether or not you've got a 3-dimensional looking model, or adding even more depth later, really, because the majority of the work's done with that base coating. So that's the last pass I'm about to do, using the contrast paint. And you'll see how that really, really makes it pop now. If you've ever watched people and you think, how do they get that super, super high value contrast on their miniatures? They're utilizing lighter pre-shades and then spraying a translucent paint over the top. And you can see it there. Where we sprayed the ice yellow has really made those parts of the armor pop even more. Gives it that great, brighter value. And it's really important to do this because, especially if you're going to do what I'm going to do with this miniature after the stage, which will be oil washing, you want the values to be higher, you want them to be brighter, because the oil wash will pull those values down a bit. especially if you filter the oil all over the miniature. Then if it's not super bright to start with, it's going to be even duller when you finish with those steps. So always go brighter than you think you need to, because if you add washes over the top, it's going to make it much darker later on. And just like before, make sure you clean your airbrush after each colour pass and colour change. As always, once you're done, clean your workspace up and you're good to go for your next project. So that's how I base coat an Imperial Fist using my airbrush. When I talk about base coating, as you can tell, it's not a single pass. It's not just one colour for everything else to go on top of. This is multiple colours on which everything else has been built off at a later stage. So I consider this to be base coating the miniature, but base coating it in a way in which you get nice shadows and nice highlights. So it gives you a good base to work off. I think it looks pretty good. Yep, I'm happy with that. Right everyone, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, please like and subscribe.